Hello, this video is about the road to revolution. And as we get started, I wanted to remind you of the fact that the French and Indian War had just ended, which had left Britain with a tremendous war debt because wars are expensive. They had fought four wars, in fact, and this was the fourth one. And they really felt that American colonists should pay a third of the cost since the Redcoats had been used to defend them. And so this is an important thing as historical context to understand all the events that are going to follow. So let's get started with the very first act. That is the Sugar Act of 1764. And this is the first law passed with the goal of raising tax revenue from the colonies. It increased the duty or tax on foreign sugar imported from the West Indies and threatened the triangular trade. The colonists responded by saying, hey, wait a minute, you can't tax us because we're not represented in Parliament. So we get this famous mantra that we are all familiar with, this idea of no taxation without representation. The next thing that was also passed just a year later is called the Quartering Act. And this is where certain colonies were now required to provide food and quarters or housing for British troops. The colonists did not object to providing food and housing. They only objected to the fact that it was now mandatory. So, a very important key word with that. In addition, there was a Currency Act in 1764 that forbade the issuing of paper money. So all of these had already happened before we get the dreaded Stamp Act of 1765. And this proposed a stamp tax to pay to support a new military force. And it mandated that a stamp be required on any paper item, such as a legal document, a playing cards, pamphlets, newspapers, diplomas, marriage licenses, wills, etc. Now, the problem with this is a direct tax. Colonists had been used to paying a little extra as part of their imported goods, kind of like a sales tax. But now everybody needed to use these paper items, and for every single piece of paper, they were going to have to pay a tax. They didn't like that at all. In addition, the Stamp Act and Sugar Act also provided that offenders be tried in admiralty courts, and they were guilty until proven innocent, where the burden of proof was on the accused, very unlike what we have today, where you are innocent until proven guilty. So the Prime Minister, George Grenville, is an important name to know. And Grenville chose to delay the proposal of the Stamp Act bill to Parliament because he wanted the colonies to approve it. Although he said that he would give the colonies the opportunity to propose another mode of taxation, this was just show and he never intended to change his mind. In fact, he manipulated the system. In Grenville's view, he believed that the colonists should pay a portion of the cost for maintaining their own defense. For 2 generations, people in Britain had endured a far heavier stamp tax. Agents told him, however, wait a minute, the colonists prefer to tax themselves. But Grenville responded that this was the same tax people in England had been paying again, as I mentioned. Grenville will also respond to these claims of no taxation without representation with what you see at the bottom, which is the idea of virtual representation. This means that every Parliament member represents all British subjects, and because the colonists were British subjects, they were automatically represented. Well, to Americans, they view the Stamp Act differently. This was a direct tax, not like the taxes on trade. Colonial assemblies had already had local taxes. Plus, at this time, there was an economic depression, and Americans were short on cash due to the Currency Act I already mentioned, as well as customs reforms. It not only hurt their pocketbooks, but to them was a violation of the liberties they had come to assume as a right. The fact that jury trials were outlawed and judges were able to decide guilt or innocence, and one was presumed guilty until proven innocent, didn't help. They felt they were being taxed unfairly for an unnecessary army, and the taxes would go to keeping an army presence in the American colonies. They denied the right of Parliament to tax them since no American colonists were actually in Parliament. They rejected this idea of virtual representation and did not want real representation either, because that would mean an increase in taxes and increased responsibility to the crown. So, how did they react? Well, the first thing is the Stamp Act Congress in October of 1765, where there were representatives of 9 colonies who met in New York City to discuss the stamp tax. And they passed a declaration of colonial rights. They said that Parliament has no right to issue taxes, and of course, this was largely ignored by Britain. The significance, however, was that it brought together representatives from different colonies and set a precedent for future resistance to British rule. Merchants threatened to boycott British goods and make their own. Others burned bundles of special watermark paper that was going to be used as stamps. I'm going to share a couple of stories because Americans have always been seen as kind of the innocent, we're the oppressed individuals in this story, but they weren't so innocent. Some of the actions that they did probably egged on the British to make other actions. So, an example is when Andrew Oliver was appointed as a distributor of stamps in Massachusetts. A small group called the Loyal Nine plotted violence against him. This group later became known as the Sons of Liberty. On August 14th of 1757, the town awoke to an effigy of Oliver hanging in a tree. An effigy is like a scarecrow. It's made of straw, but it's meant to represent a person. The lieutenant governor, Thomas Hutchinson, ordered the sheriff and his officers to remove this effigy, but they refused, saying that it might cost them and their officers their lives. That night, a mob took the effigy of Oliver through town to Oliver's Dock, where a building that was meant to be rented to shopkeepers was denounced as the stamp office. It took the mob only 5 minutes to destroy the building. Then the mob set off for Oliver's house, where they beheaded the effigy and burned it. Others broke windows in the house and called for people to find Oliver and kill him. Oliver was nowhere to be found, so they settled for destroying his furniture. That's one example. Another pretty harsh example that I've heard of is in Connecticut, where in New Providence, a crowd threatened to bury alive a distributor. He basically was waiting on his commission to come from Britain and said, "Hold on, I want to remain in office till I get this commission, and then I'll denounce it." However, the crowd got angry. They grabbed him, put him in a coffin, nailed the lid shut, lowered him into the grave, and began shoveling dirt on the coffin. Finally, he's screaming, "Wait, wait, wait, I'll resign." And he submitted his resignation, and nothing bad happened, thankfully. But you can see that the colonists weren't so innocent. If you look here on the right-hand side of the two pictures, the bottom one is of them tarring and feathering an individual. The top one shows just how they felt about this stamp tax, as it is fatal, that is going to destroy the economy. It's going to kill them. So perhaps a little bit overly dramatic in their assessment. An additional thing that happened was the creation of committees of correspondence. And these are designed kind of as the ways that the different colonies are going to communicate with each other throughout this time period and into the American Revolution. But then the British are going to debate this. And in Parliament, there were demands for them to repeal the stamp tax. And merchants said the stamp tax was a problem for the health of the economy and might end trade to get altogether with the colonies. William Pitt, who was a respected member of Parliament, opposed the stamp tax. And he said that it was not right for them to tax the colonies. He viewed the American colonists having all the rights of Englishmen and being bound by English laws. He also thought they were subject to the protection of the British Constitution, which included the right to be taxed by one's own representatives. So he dismissed the idea that anyone in England represented the American colonies. Prime Minister Grenville responded, and I quote, "Protection and obedience are reciprocal. Great Britain protects America. America is bound to yield obedience. If not, tell me when the Americans were emancipated. When they want protection of this kingdom, they are always ready to ask for it. That protection has always been afforded them in the most full and ample manner. The nation has run itself into an immense debt to give them their protection, and now they are called upon to contribute a small share towards the public expense, an expense arising from themselves. They renounce your authority, insult your officers, and break out, I might almost say, into open rebellion." So clearly, he thinks that a rebellion is going to happen, and the Americans are just lacking gratitude and they're just being whiny. William Pitt replies with praise for the American resistance and says, I quote, "I rejoice that America has resisted. 3 million people so dead to all the feelings of liberty as voluntarily to submit to be slaves would have been fit instruments to make slaves of the rest of us." In the end, Parliament still decides that it has the right to tax, but doesn't want to make this into a big deal. And they decide to repeal the Stamp Act in March of 1766. However, at the same time, they passed the Declaratory Act, proclaiming that Parliament does, in fact, have the right to tax colonists as it sees fit. So it's a small win, but at the same time, Britain is kind of throwing it back in the faces of the colonists, saying, you win this one, but you're not going to win them all. Next, we have the Townshend Acts. And these are named after a gifted speaker named Champagne Charlie Townsend, and he was someone who could deliver brilliant speeches in Parliament, perhaps while having taken a little too much of that champagne. And he says that he is going to promise to pluck the feathers from the colonial goose with a minimum of squawking. So he persuades Parliament to pass these acts. His proposed plan includes suspending the Suspending Act, where the New York Assembly would be suspended until it agreed to comply with the Quartering Act. And then also this Revenue Act that includes a small tax on glass, tea, paper, lead, and paint. To the American colonists, it revived their fears and resentments that people are trying to plot against their liberty. By suspending New York's assembly, it's further evidence to them that Parliament is desiring to destroy their constitutional rights. For them, the real difficulty remained taxes in any form without representation. So, because of their recent victory over the Stamp Tax, colonists were in a rebellious mood. One of the things that they did was to non-importation, which was the idea of we're not going to import anything and we're just going to ruin the trade of the British and we'll just make our own stuff. John Dickinson wrote Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. He was not, in fact, actually a real farmer. He was the son of a planter, but he practiced law in Philadelphia. And he wrote this series of 14 essays that appealed to those individuals who were fatigued by this extravagant rhetoric and speech that was going on and also the violence. And he makes modest recommendations for the repeal of the Townshend Act. And he denies Britain's right to levy taxes for the purpose of revenue. But he's going to challenge the distinction of internal versus external taxes. And he makes it as possible for reluctant colonists to confront the issues without agreeing to the mob violence and upheavals. Following that, we end up with, as I mentioned, the circular letters. And Massachusetts is going to start with one that says that colonial legislatures should harmonize with each other, meaning they should communicate with this. Virginia's House of Burgesses had not met for 2 years because they had been seen as a problematic body who was threatening to overthrow the monarchy. But the governor died in 1768, and so the legislature was summoned once again. And they had petitions from Virginia counties against the suspension of the New York Assembly, against taxation, and they didn't want to become independent. It's really important, but they did not want to see their rights infringed either, so they issued their own circular letter. Which leads us to the next part, where ongoing tensions, circular letters, and perceiving the ideas that there was going to be violence, the governor of Massachusetts dissolves the Massachusetts legislature. This is going to give those Sons of Liberty a new issue. The freedom of people's representatives to gather and petition for a redress of grievances was now being denied. Because of these challenges, the British decided to send troops to Boston. And at the time, Boston was a city of only 20,000 inhabitants. And the British sent 4,000 troops. So to the colonists, this seemed to be quite a large number. And many of the soldiers were drunken characters, and the liberty-loving colonials resented their presence, and they called them ruffians. They taunted them as bloody backs, lobster backs, because of what they were wearing. And this is going to cause problems within the town. In addition, in Boston, the women would stop serving British tea to their husbands. They renounced their fine clothes. Spinning bees became popular, and things were not going well. So in Boston, the continued anger against British troops led to an inevitable clash. And civilians, as early as 1768, started taunting the redcoats, spitting on them, doing all kinds of things to provoke them. And this is going to continue on for a while until the evening of March 5th, 1770. And I'm going to describe the scene for you, and I want you to compare it to the image you're going to see on the next picture, which we're going to discuss in our in-person meetings. But on the evening of March 5th, 1770, so there's still snow on the ground. It's a dark evening, and the British are going to be at the defensive. There's a small group that are sent to protect, to set up in this round protective way. And Colonel Preston orders them to have their arms at their sides, their weapons at their sides, ready to, if in case needed, but not appearing to provoke. And snow is being thrown at the redcoats, and somehow someone yells the word fire, and shots are fired, and 5 people die. The first of these to die was Crispus Attucks, who was a mulatto, meaning he was part European, part African. So now I'd like you to consider this engraving by Paul Revere and notice how there's been some embellishments. It doesn't appear that there is much snow. It appears that Colonel Preston in the back is ordering them to fire. It appears that they are firing on these poor defenseless colonists who have done nothing wrong. And it is done as a piece of propaganda to convince colonists that the British are bad. In fact, it is known as the Boston Massacre, even though only 5 people died. The Commander Preston, many believed he gave the order to fire, but there is a trial that is going to reveal that he was standing in the front of the guns between his men and crowd, so would not have ordered them to fire. And just as a fun fact, John Adams, future President John Adams, serves as a defense attorney for Colonel Preston. 8 were charged, but only 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, and the soldiers were released after being branded on their hands. This is obviously going to further fuel the problems that are going on between the British and the Americans, which leads to the Tea Act of 1773. Now, something to understand about this is that the East India Company was facing bankruptcy due to corruption and mismanagement. And they were going to, through this act, actually cut out the middleman, and they were going to sell directly to the American colonists without having an extra tax. In fact, they were going to be cheaper for the Americans to receive their tea. However, the issue at this point has no longer about the price, it is about the principle of the matter. And so 3 ships from London, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, are going to sail into Boston Harbor. And they're going to be loaded with tea from the East India Company and anchor at Griffin's Wharf. But they will be prevented from unloading their cargo. Fearing that the tea would be seized for failure to pay customs duties and eventually become available for sale, something had to be done. It could not be returned to England by law, and demanding that the tea be returned to where it came from or face retribution, the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, began to meet to determine what to do. On the cold evening of December 16, 1773, a large band of patriots disguised as Mohawk Indians burst from the South Meeting House with the spirit of freedom burning in their eyes, and they headed towards Griffith's Wharf in the 3 ships. They went to work striking chests with axes and hatchets, and soon, by 9 o'clock, the Sons of Liberty had emptied a total of 342 crates of tea into Boston Harbor. Fearing any connection to their treasonous deed, the patriots took off their shoes and shook them overboard. They swept the ship's decks and made each ship's first mate attest to that only the tea was damaged. About 90,000 pounds of tea was destroyed, or the value of 10,000 pounds. The British obviously were very unhappy with this, and so they passed a series of acts that became known as the Intolerable Acts. The first one was called the Boston Port Act, and this closed the port of Boston until the price of the dumped tea was recovered. The second one was another quartering act, which allowed royal troops to stay in houses or empty buildings if barracks were not available. The third one, the Administration of Justice Act, allowed the royal governor of a colony to move capital trials to other colonies or even to England if he feared the juries in these colonies would not judge a case fairly. The fourth one, the Massachusetts Governing Act, converted Massachusetts into a royal colony, made all law officers subject to appointment by the royal governor. Sheriffs selected juries and banned all town meetings that didn't have the approval of the royal governor. And finally, the Quebec Act, which granted civil government and religious freedom to French Catholics in Quebec. That last one really wasn't directly involving the colonies, but it served kind of as an extra slap in their face because here the Canadians were getting something that they themselves were not being given the opportunity to have. So these acts were by far the harshest of the acts that were passed by the Parliament. And so the colonists are going to begin to react in a number of different ways because the Boston Port Bill strangled Boston economically, and she became cut off from others. Some people began to smuggle and to bring donations in to Boston of rice, wheat, sugar, flour, sheep, etc., to help them. Other colonies stepped up and helped. Sam Adams proposed that Boston suspend all trade with Great Britain. And we begin with the Suffolk Resolves, where they called the Intolerable Acts murderous and urged resistance, withholding of taxes, at ceasing all trade with Britain, Ireland, and British West Indies, stop consuming British products, and prepare for war. Now, this was a little too much radicalization for most people. And so, in the First Continental Congress, 64 delegates met in September of 1774. 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates. Georgia decided against getting involved at this point because they were facing attacks from the Creek Native Americans that were on their border, and they really needed the help of the British soldiers to repel them. So this Congress, which continued in session until late October, did not advocate independence. Very important. They are still not at that point yet. They still want to figure this out. They want to right the wrongs that have been inflicted upon them. And they hoped that having a unified voice, they could get London and Britain, British government in total, to listen to them. And there are other things that are part of this. There is a Declaration of Rights and Grievances that is written as part of this, which is addressed to King George III, to whom the delegates remained loyal, not to Parliament, and he basically, it was ignored at the time. Then in April of 1775, there was the first shots that rang out of this. British General Thomas Gage, who was the new governor of Massachusetts, sent 700 soldiers to destroy guns and ammunition that colonists had stored in the town of Concord, just outside of Boston. They also planned to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, two of the key leaders of the Patriot movement. When they learned of British plans, Paul Revere was sent to alert John Hancock and Samuel Adams, and this is when he gave his famous midnight ride. The plan was to alert people by putting lanterns in the Old North Church steeple. He would light one lantern if the British were coming by land and two lanterns if the British were coming by sea. On the evening of April 18th, the British troops were ferried across Boston Harbor to start their march on Lexington. Paul Revere hung the lanterns, the two lanterns in the church steeple, and then he, along with a couple of other people, because it seems like it's always Paul Revere by himself, but it's not, they rode to warn the colonists that the British were coming. When the British soldiers reached Lexington, Captain Jonas Parker and 75 armed Minutemen were there to meet them. They were greatly outnumbered. The British soldiers fired, killing 8 Minutemen and injuring 10 others. Although Paul Revere was captured by British scouts before reaching Concord, other messengers managed to get through and warn the people. While the British soldiers continued on their way to Concord, the men and women of Concord were busy moving the arms and ammunition to hiding places in surrounding towns. When the soldiers arrived, they were only able to destroy the supplies. Now, something that you are going to be working on is trying to decide who actually fired the first shot, because it's a bit of a history mystery. Because even though we think that perhaps it was, and we'd like to blame it on the British, there's a lot of evidence that points that it could be either side. And so you're going to engage in a discussion with several other classmates to determine who actually fired the first shot. As things continue to deteriorate after these first shots are fired, delegates from 13 colonies will begin meeting in May of 1775. We do have the first couple of battles that will ensue in this middle time of Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. And there will be one last attempt that's going to be made in July of 1775 for the Olive Branch Petition, where they're going to reach out and say, King George, we don't want to be independent. We want to be part of England, but we need you to listen to us. He will ignore them, to which the colony of Virginia will declare its rights, many of which will then be borrowed in the Declaration of Independence on July 4th of 1776. And that is how we get the road to revolution turning into the actual American Revolution. Thank you.